Okay, so we're going to be looking at Marchesa the Black Rose as our commander deck tech today. So let's read what Marchesa has to say. Alright, Marchesa is a legendary human wizard. She costs 1 blue, black, and red, and she has Dethrone, which means whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it. She also extends the Dethrone ability to all of my other creatures. And in addition, whenever a creature I control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, it gets returned to the battlefield under my control at the beginning of the next end step. I like to call this an insurance policy. You may be hearing me saying that again and again during this video, so just keep that in mind. She's a 3/3. For the 4 mana that she costs to play, she's incredibly efficient, and she definitely ramps up to a larger creature. So, we'll be taking a look at some of the cards in the deck. A lot of the things focus around the +1/+1 counter ability. There's a lot of really powerful stuff that you can play in here. Alright, we'll start off with going over the lands, and then after that we'll start going over each of the other cards based on casting cost. Alright, so let's go check out the lands. Alright, so the first thing we're looking at is the land base. To stay competitive and make sure you get a lot of generous mana in the beginning, there's a lot of lands. I'm running 36. It's about the average that most people run in a commander deck. But the thing to notice is that a lot of the cards in here are not very high mana cost. So there's a lot of lands in comparison to the casting cost of most of my cards. But we'll see that why it's happening later. Alright, so the first thing I have is 6 basic islands. Alright. We have 4 mountains. We don't need mountains too much, but we do need them for casting spells. Alright, we have 5 swamps. Alright, so that's the basic land count. It's always good to have basic lands in case somebody drops a Blood Moon. But even in this case, Blood Moon would help quite a bit. Alright, Command Tower. It's obvious choice. 1 mana of any color on my commander's identity. That's an obvious drop. Crumbling Necropolis. Same thing, comes into play tapped and adds any of the 3 mana that I need. Alright, Mana Confluence and City of Brass. These 2 cards together are great because it will lower my life total to help trigger the Dethrone ability. You may even find yourself using the tapping the lands for mana, but not even utilizing that mana if you just need to get your life total 1 point lower. Right, another must-have in here is a Commander staple. I usually don't run these in Commander decks, but the ability for Opal Palace is amazing. You get 1 mana of any color in your Commander's color identity. If you cast your Commander, it comes into play with number +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number times it's been cast from the command zone this game. So it immediately puts Marchesa into play with that +1/+1 counter, so once Marchesa comes into play and it dies, she's coming right back at the next end step anyway. So this card is a must-have. Alright, some cards that I had lying around, because that's how I build most of my decks. I have a dual land, Badlands, so it's a swamp and a mountain. Alright, just a good card to run in here. Alright, Drowned Catacombs, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. Sunken Hollow and Smoldering Marsh, the Tango lands, because it takes 2 to tango. That's where the name came from. I like it. Sounds good. A lot of people will disagree. But these are just great cards to come in. Late in the game, they come in great, or first turn drop if you need to get it out. I may recognize from my Tassiger deck, I pulled out my Sunken Ruins, and I put it into here. It's a nice expedition. It's gorgeous. I'm very proud of it. Alright, it taps blue or black, get blue, black, or black to your mana pool. Alright, Shivan Reef and Underground River. These 2 cards are great to run because they do damage to you. So once again, just like Mana Confluence and City of Brass, you can get your life total a little bit lower to take advantage of Dethrone. Alright, I have a Watery Grave in here also. 2 life gets you lower. Just gets that Dethrone ability ready. Alright, I have a Rakdos Carnarium and a Is It Boiler Works. These 2 are just bounce lands. They come into play tapped, and you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. I like having lands in hand in the game in case, mass land destruction or anything else clears the field. I've seen that in my meta, and it's just a great thing to have so you can bounce at least 1 or 2 lands back to your hand. Alright, we have a Polluted Delta and a Bloodstained Mire as the fetch lands. They'll pull out anything. It's nice to have the Shock Land or the Dual Land to be pulled from here, or even the Tango lands, just to help pull them out and get the diversity. Flamekin Village. Enters the battlefield, you can reveal an elemental. If you don't, it comes to the battlefield tapped. Taps for red. Red tap, target creature gains haste until end of turn. Well, I can put out the creature, give it haste, and hopefully swing for that Dethrone +1/+1 counter. There's also a couple elementals in here, so it works out great. Alright. Manamo, School at Water's Edge. Just taps for blue, but blue tap, untap target legendary permanent. It's great to untap Marchesa, use her as a blocker with a +1/+1 counter on it, anticipate her dying, having her come back into play at the end step. Alright, a Grixis Panorama, just a great way to get a basic island, swamp, or mountain. It does fixing, and it does a good job at getting anything that you could possibly need. And finally, I also put in a Desolate Lighthouse. Taps for colorless, or 1 blue-red, tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Just a great way to get rid of stuff if you don't need it in your hand. It's a nice little utility land in here. Alright, so that's the land base. 36 lands, you know, it's a lot of stuff, but a lot of the stuff really, really helps. And like I said, I built this from scratch and stuff that I had lying around, so, you know, you're not going to see every single must-have card in here. Alright, next up we'll move to the 1-drops and see what's going on with those. Alright, so our first 1-drop is Kosi's Trickster. It's blue for a 1/1. Whenever an opponent shuffles his or her library, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Kosi's Trickster. In Commander, almost everybody shuffles their library. Dropping this turn 1 and having it turn into like a 6/6 or 7/7 by turn 4 is a really nice board presence, and the best part is it keeps coming back again and again. Alright, we have a Carrion Feeder. It's part of a sacrifice engine. Nice thing to get stuff to keep sacrificing and get enter the battlefield triggers. It's black for a 1/1, can't block. Sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. You know, it's just a nice way to sacrifice a creature and make sure it's coming back, and also to put a +1/+1 counter on this guy. I put in an Arcbound Worker. I don't really have many artifact creatures in this deck, but the fact that it keeps coming into play with a +1/+1 counter on it means that it's rarely going to die. Being colorless to play, it's another great card that you can just simply drop on turn 1 no matter what. I put in a Skull Clamp, just with some of the sacrificing engines. If I can get Arcbound Worker, Marchesa, and Skull Clamp out, it's a nice little recurring combo going on every turn, nets me 2 cards, pulls Arcbound Worker back into play. Alright, I decided to put in a Preordain, scry 2, then draw a card. Just a nice way to set up for later on in the game. I also put in a Serum Visions, draw a card, scry 2. Just once again, nice way to get some setup going. Alright, so those are the 1-drops. Alright, after that we'll be looking at the 2-drops, 3, 4, 5, etc., etc. Alright, so in this deck I wanted to run a bit of an Infect sub-theme. So I have some creatures that have Infect, and the cool thing about Infect creatures is they don't lower your opponent's life total. So I can get the 10 Infect counters quite easily in Commander. Especially if they keep getting a +1/+1 counter on it hitting every turn. So you're going to see a lot of Infect creatures in here. I like it. I like the way that they work, and it's a very, very fun mechanic to run. So the first thing I put in, obviously, a Blighted Agent. 1/1 Infect, it's unblockable, so it's just an amazing card to drop turn 2 and just having a scary board presence. Get Marchesa out a little bit later, and now Blighted Agent they have to deal with, but they also have to deal with it again and again and again. Alright, I put in a Plague Stinger, similar card, 1 in black for a 1/1 flying Infect, just a nice way to start pinging my opponent. Put in a Plague Mir, nice on turn 2 because you can play it with any type of mana, and it also taps for a colorless mana as well, so it's a nice thing that I can use to start accelerating my drops. Marchesa Smuggler, one of the huge powerful cards for this deck. First off, it's a blue and red for a 1/1 Dethrone, which already makes it pretty sweet. But then you throw on the other ability, 1 blue-red, target creature you control gains haste until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. So all of a sudden now I can start making my Infect creatures or anything else unblockable, and I can do all of the Dethrone bonus damage to my opponent. Baleful Strix, blue and black for a 1/1 flying Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. If I can get a counter on it, it's 2 damage to my opponent already in the air, and then when it dies, it'll come back and I get to draw another card. This card is just bonkers in almost any deck. Phantasmal Image, 1 in blue for an illusion. Alright, comes into play as enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it's an illusion, and when it becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. So if I can just get that +1/+1 counter on it, I'll be perfectly fine. And if a better target comes out later, I can always have it come into play as a copy of that. Thrumming Bird is another great card for this deck, because at some point your creatures with Marchesa are going to get so powerful that you won't be getting Dethrone abilities because you'll keep knocking down their life. If you can get Thrumming Bird into play, you can start proliferating all those +1/+1 counters. In addition, you can proliferate poison counters, and that is a really, really powerful system to use for this deck. I put in Una's Blackguard. Each other rogue comes into play with a +1/+1 counter on it. There's like 1 or 2 rogues in here. But the real kicker with this card is that whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, they discard a card. So now all my dethrone abilities that trigger now give my creatures the ability to cause discarding as well. Right, I put in a Magma Quake in here. X damage to each creature without flying and each planeswalker. Takes care of planeswalkers, takes care of creatures, can also clear the field at the end of my opponent's turn, so I will have my creatures come back at the end step, and then I can swing through for some serious damage. Put in a counterspell to protect myself for some things. I don't have too many counterspells or counter magic in here, but I decided to put in the most generic of them. I also put in a Muddle of a Mixture, counter target instant or sorcery spell, but it can also transmute for any one of those cards that I want. Often this will take Thrumming Bird or Blighted Agent or Phantasmal Image, or even a better counterspell if I know something big and scary is coming. Or I can search for this, Cyclonic Rift. Every deck that runs blue needs to run this card. There is no further discussion on it. It's 1 in blue, return target unland permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. The Overload does everything that you don't control, so all your opponent's non-land cards get bounced back. It's a nice way to clear the board for the final swing. Put in a Demonic Tutor to find some cool stuff that I want. You'll see some things later that are definitely worth tutoring for. A couple things in here too, just to change the nature of the game. Alright. We have a Lightning Greaves. 2 mana, equipped creature has haste and can't be the target of spells or abilities. You want to give your creatures some sort of protection from being stolen or destroyed or whatever. You can also equip this onto a new creature that came into play, give it haste so it can swing for a +1/+1 counter bonus. Right. And also an Impulse. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, rest on the bottom, and shuffle. It's just a fun card to run to, fish for some powerful things in your deck. Alright, I put in all 3 of the Signets. Alright, they are 2 mana for an artifact, pay 1 tap, add the 2 colors associated with the guild. They're just great cards to run. Alright, and I also put in the 2 Talismans, Talisman of Indulgence and Talisman of Dominance. They add blue or black, or black and red to your mana pool, and does 1 damage to you. It gets your life lower and also gives you some acceleration. Alright, on to the 3-drops. Alright, so looking at 3-drops. First one, Phyrexian Crusader. 1 black for a 2/2. First strike, pro-red and pro-white, and it has Infect. This creature has a ton of crazy powerful abilities, and it fits that sub-theme of Infect. I also put in an Ichor Rats, 1 black for a 2/1 Infect. When it enters the battlefield, each player gets a poison counter. So if I can get a +1/+1 counter on it, I can keep ticking up the poison counters. Put in some Proliferate or things like that. I don't even need to swing for lethal damage with an Infect creature to kill my opponents. Whispering Spectre, another card that I use. 1 black for a 1/1 Flying Infect. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, I may sacrifice it. If I do, that player discards a card for each poison counter he or she has. Well, if Whispering Spectre has a +1/+1 counter on it, it'll do 2 Infect damage. I can sacrifice it to make him discard 2 cards, and it will come back at the beginning of the next end step. This is a very scary threat combined with Marchesa. I put in a Simic Flux Mage. It's 2 in blue for a 1/2. It evolves, so it gets stronger as bigger creatures come into play. I can pay 1 blue tap, move a +1/+1 counter from Simic Flux Mage onto target creature. So I can keep distributing the insurance policies onto other creatures, especially if I don't have the dethrone ability. I just need to keep playing larger creatures and bouncing the counters from stuff to others. Put in a Chasm Skulker, 2 in blue for a 1/1. Whenever I draw a card, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. So if it survives a full turn, it already has that insurance policy built. When it dies, I put X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk onto the battlefield, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on it. So it also, when it dies, gives me a bunch of 1/1s. Those in turn may also get the Dethrone ability, making them 2/2s with Island Walk. Also, it just keeps coming back, and I keep making armies of 1/1 blue squid tokens. Tarian Mauler. This card is a no-brainer for this deck. It's 2 in red for a 2/2. Changeling, so it's that elemental. You'll also see some other tribal things going on. It's also a rogue. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, I may put a +1/+1 counter on this. In a 4-player game, this thing is getting very large very fast. I think this turned into like a 26/26 the last time I played because it went unchecked. Sage of Fables, there we go, it's a tribal. Each other wizard creature you control comes into play with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Also, a nice thing to note, Marchesa is a wizard. So if you have Sage of Fables into play, you automatically have Marchesa come into play with a insurance policy. You can pay 2 to remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control to draw a card. So if I get double dethroned, I can remove one of the counters to draw a card and replenish my hand. Rage Forger, 2 in red, comes into play. Put a +1/+1 counter on each shaman creature you control. Tribal again. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, you may have that creature deal 1 damage to target player. This on an infect creature already ticks up their poison counter by 1 immediately without even having to worry about blockers. Drana, Liberator of Malakir, 1 black for a 2/3 flying first strike. When it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. Oh look, I am the highest life total. The throne doesn't really matter anymore because Drana is going to do some serious damage. And the fact that she hits first strike means that your other creatures get that +1/+1 counter boost before their damage is dealt, so it makes it even scarier. Pyreheart Wolf, 2 in red for a 1/1. When it attacks, each creature you control can't be blocked this turn except by 2 or more creatures. I think the mechanic now is called Menace, and it also has Undying. So when it dies, it comes back into play with a +1/+1 counter on it. If it dies again, it comes back at the end of the turn because Marchesa put an insurance policy on it. Necroplasm, 1 black. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a counter on this. At the end of your turn, destroy each creature with converted mana cost equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it, and it has Dredge too. So it gets stronger faster. It takes out a lot of smaller creatures quickly. Also, the turn you play it takes care of every token, and that's kind of why I run this card. That's actually one of the only reasons. But it also takes out some serious threats. Unspeakable Symbol is the staple of the deck. 1 black for an enchantment, pay 3 life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Nice way to put insurance policies and get your dethrone triggers running and make infect creatures extremely scary. Darksteel Ingot, just 3 mana for an indestructible mana rock. Nice card to use. And I also put in a Toxic Deluge. An additional cost, you have to pay X life. All creatures get -X till end of turn. It's a nice field clearance, and it also gets your life total below the highest total of players. Alright, on to 4-drops. Alright, so 4-drops. First card, Viral Drake. It's a 1/4 flying infect for 3 in blue. You can also pay 3 in blue to proliferate, so add an additional +1/+1 counter at all your creatures, or give your opponents more poison counters. It's an alternate win condition, and it's also just a nice way to keep proliferating again and again. Even if I wasn't running the infect sub-theme, I'd still run this card just for the proliferate mechanic. Cytoplasm Manipulator, Graft 2. So it comes to play with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever another creature comes into play, I can move a counter from this creature onto it, including my opponent's creatures. I can pay blue tap, gain control of target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it as long as this card remains in play. Here's the thing though, if I take a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it and it dies, Marchesa still brings it back to my side. So I could use this once to steal a creature, nuke the field, Cytoplasm Manipulator comes back at end of turn, so does the creature that I stole because it had a +1/+1 counter on it and it was under my control. And then I can just, once again, use Cytoplasm Manipulator again and again and again. Dax Duplicate, 2 blue-red for Shapeshifter, comes into play as a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it gains haste and dethrone. So right immediately I can put this out. It's got double dethrone, so it gets counters. Makes a copy of things, so if it keeps coming back into play, I can keep copying the best thing in the field. And it has haste, which is a really, really great thing to have for a 4-drop. Clever Impersonator comes into battlefield as a copy of any non-land permanent, so that's a little bit more control. It's a nice way to seriously make the field a little confusing and interesting, I'd like to say. And if you make it as a creature and it dies after getting a +1/+1 counter on it, it's coming back to copy something else. Glenalendra Archmage. Alright, this is one of my favorite cards. If I can get the Sage of Fables that brings wizards back into play with a +1/+1 counter on it, this creature almost never dies. Or if I can get a dethroned +1/+1 counter on it, it'll cancel out the Persist. So it's 3 in blue for a 2/2 flying, blue sacrifice it, counter target non-creature spell. It persists, so it means it comes right back into play, but if you can somehow get another +1/+1 counter on it, those 2 counters actually cancel out according to the Wizards of the Coast rules. So if you can get this out with something that cancels out those -1/-1 counters from Persist, you have a very, very scary board presence. If you have 3 blue mana, that means your opponents can have up to 3 non-creature spells countered every turn. Aura Thief should be in almost every blue deck. 3 in blue for a 2/2 flying. When it dies, you gain control of all enchantments, so you get to steal a lot of powerful stuff. If I can get a +1/+1 counter on it, it's even better, because anything that gets played after the theft, I can use it once again to start stealing stuff. Treasonous Ogre, 3 in red for a 2/3 dethrone, so it's already got some cool stuff going on it, but I can pay 3 life to add red to my mana pool. It's nice to get your life total lower, even if you don't use the mana, but it's also great for some more expensive cards that you want to play early in the game. And then finally I put in Breath of Fury. 2 red, it's enchant creature you control. When it deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it, and attach Breath of Fury to another creature that I control. If I do, untap my creatures, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So, I attack. All my creatures get a dethrone bonus. I have to sacrifice that creature. I reattach Breath of Fury to another one of my creatures. I can attack with all of them again. Sacrifice that creature. Reattach again and again and again with however many creatures I have. Cool thing is, they're all coming back into play at the end of the turn. So I can get 5, 6, maybe even 7 full combat swings on this. And with the Infect sub-mechanic, I think that's more than enough to call it a game. Alright, so those are the 4 drops. Moving on to the 5 drops. Alright, so 5 drops. First one, Reaper of Shieldred. A 4 black for a 2/5 Infect. Whenever a source deals damage to Reaper of Shieldred, that source's controller gets a poison counter. Well, it'll attack, and if they block, they automatically get a poison counter. If it got a +1/+1 dethrone bonus, it doesn't even matter if it dies, because it's coming back. It's also a nice blocker at the end of the game. If, let's say, extremely hypothetical, my opponent has 9 poison counters, and I have this out as a blocker, my opponent can't really even attack me. So that's kind of a scary catch-22 that your opponent can be locked into. I put in Slave of Bolas. It's 3, it's red or blue hybrid, and black. Gain control of target creature, untap it, it gains haste until end of turn, then sacrifice it at end of turn. So I steal my opponent's creature, I can start attacking with it. It might get a dethrone bonus, which is the only situation I'd ever use for it. I have to sacrifice it, but then it comes back into play under my control since it got the +1/+1 counter. Slave of Bolas is a nice way to take care of things that are indestructible or, whatever reason you just can't deal with. If you can't deal with it, just steal it. Alright, Sidisi Undead Vizier, 3 black for a 4/6 Death Touch with Exploit. Alright, when it enters the battlefield, I may sacrifice a creature, and when it does that, I can search my library for a card, put it in my hand, and shuffle my library. Sidisi is just a nice beefy body with Death Touch, and it also lets me sacrifice stuff. And it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter, or my sacrifice creature has a +1/+1 counter. It's going to come back into play, so no big loss at all. Puppeteer Cleek, the same thing with the Persist mechanic with Glen Elendra. If I can get +1/+1 counters on it, I can cancel out the quote-unquote this card doesn't revive. It's a 3/2 flying. When it enters the battlefield, put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. At the beginning of your next end step, exile it. So, yeah, it's not perfect because it's exiling cards, but it's a nice way to pull your opponent's graveyard cards and swing for lethal. Grimgrin Corpseborn, 3 blue-black for a 5/5, enters the battlefield tapped, doesn't untap. Sacrifice another creature to untap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Whenever it attacks, destroy target creature defending player controls and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So, yeah, it's got a lot of different +1/+1 mechanics that swing in. The fact that it doesn't untap doesn't really make a huge difference, especially if I can keep knocking the dethrone mechanic again and again and again. Alright, Skrillex the Blight Dragon. I love this card to death. It's 3 black for a 4/4 flying infect. Alright, pay black, it gains haste until end of turn, and black to regenerate it. Get a dethrone bonus on this and swing for the first time, you're automatically halfway there to killing one of your opponents. And it's going to be really hard to destroy it if it has a +1/+1 counter on it. And it also has the regenerate ability, so it gets a little scary. And finally, for the last 5 drop, I put in River Kelpie, 3 blue for a 3/3. Whenever River Kelpie or another permanent is put into play from a graveyard, draw a card. Whenever a spell is played from a graveyard, draw a card. And it has Persist. River Kelpie brings you a lot of cards to your hand. This should be run in almost every deck because Reanimator mechanics, Flashback, Past in Flames, there's so much different stuff that's run from the graveyard. This is a really, really nice way to just keep benefiting from that mechanic. And the fact that it's a 3/3 doesn't make it a huge threat that your opponents will go after, until they've seen you draw 5 or 6 cards already, and then they have to do something to intervene. Alright, so those are the 5 drops. Next up, we'll do the 6 and more drops, because there's a very few number of cards with that mana cost. Alright, our first 6 drop is Sphinx of the Mrquez. 3 blue, blue, blue for a 6/6 flying. You can pay 2 blue, draw a card, then put a +1/+1 counter on Sphinx of Mrquez. Well, that's a nice way to get that insurance policy going, and it's a nice way to draw a card. This card is an absolute beast for hand advantage, beatdown, evasion, and for this deck, well, the +1/+1 counter insurance policy. Flayer the Hatebound, 5 in red for a 4/2. It has Undying, so it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter on it. It gets returned when it dies. All right, and when this or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. With some of my infect creatures, getting them to come back into play is just a nice way to hit my opponent twice for extra damage. And it also has Undying, so it's going to be really hard to destroy if Marchesa is out in play. Mrquez the Unhallowed, 3 black, black, black for a 5/5 Intimidate. Whenever a human deals damage to you, destroy it. Other non-human creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Undying. I have quite a few humans in here, but to be able to put this on any card with Undying and the Marchesa insurance policy, this card just makes my cards even harder and harder to destroy. Necropolis Regent, 3 black, black, black for a 6/5 flying. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. By the time this thing hits play, I don't even care about Dethrone. My opponent is definitely going to have less life than me. And this is just going to make my creatures twice as powerful every turn coming around. On Infect, that's even scarier. Kiga the Tidestar, 5 blue for a 5/5 flying. When it's put into a graveyard from play, gain control of target creature. Well, that's cool, especially if Kiga got a +1/+1 counter on it from Dethrone, and now is coming back into play, and I'll keep having it die again and again, and keep gaining control of creatures. Spinal Embrace, very similar to Slave of Bolas, 3 blue, blue, black. Cast it only during combat. Untap creature I don't control, gain control of it. It gains haste. At the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice it. If I do, I gain life equal to its toughness. So very similar, except this is played during combat. I'm going to attack, gain the Dethrone bonus, then sacrifice it, then bring it back into play. The only difference is I'm gaining life equal to its toughness. So it's just a nice way to, get a little bit of life going. I know that doesn't fit the theme of Dethrone, but at this point, later in the game, you don't really care about the Dethrone bonus. Alright, our only 7 drop is Grave Betrayal. Alright, it's 5 black, black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. The +1/+1 counter is the biggest thing for this, because all of a sudden my opponent's creatures die, comes back into play with a +1/+1 counter on my side. If it dies again, I get it one more time. And finally, I decided to put in a Blasphemous Act. I love this card because if I'm running short on creatures or I just need to nuke the field, it costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield. So it usually ends up costing red or like 2 in red at most. It does 13 damage to each creature. So running this is a nice way to nuke the field, especially second main phase, and then all of a sudden at the end step, you get all of your creatures back if they had +1/+1 counters on them. So it's a nice one-sided wipe if you can play it right. Alright, so that's Marchesa. This is my personal build on it. I found in multiplayer games it runs quite well because nobody sees you as a threat with a bunch of 2, 3, and 4 drops. But then when you start putting out the huge stuff, it's already too late, especially when all of your creatures have the +1/+1 counter insurance policies. So, if you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section of the video. And if you like these videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. I really do appreciate everybody who does that. Alright, this is Brian Fadouk. Hope you enjoyed my deck tech with Marchesa the Black Rose. Thanks for watching.